Assalamu alaikum. All right, it's good to be here. I came down from Birmingham like just now, so if I'm a little bit tired from the driving, I apologize. No, so it's actually a really interesting invitation. Malcolm is somebody, my favorite person in history, but I'm actually not a Muslim, right? And actually, if you read the book, and we'll get into this, about some of the myths about Malcolm, is one of the points of writing this book is to say, what was Malcolm's political philosophy? And one of the major myths that I want to kind of focus on today is this idea that he's moved from the Nation of Islam, you all know the Nation of Islam, into more Orthodox Islam is this big change, right? And more than a big change, it really is kind of an evolution more than a change, which I'm going to talk about and say why that's important, right? In terms of today, what was Malcolm trying to do? What was Malcolm trying to organize? And Malcolm's international politics are one of the things which is almost overlooked, right? There's this idea that once he goes to Mecca, he then finds the rest of the world and then he gets killed. But actually, Malcolm has a really, really strong international politics from 50s onwards, right? Which is really important to his political program. We do have someone in the room, Gayasuddin Siddiqui, who's just over there, who was part of the delegation that invited Malcolm up to Sheffield in '64. And so I think it's worth recognizing the presence, because I think that's really important history. Because one of the questions I get asked, obviously I always say I'm not from. I'm in the UK, not necessarily from the UK. This is a whole dispute. If you want to ask me in the Q&A why I never say Black British, I will tell you. But it is about Malcolm in a very real way. So people do ask me why Malcolm X, thousands of miles away, 60 years ago. He would have been 100 years old this year, 60 years since he was assassinated. So why Malcolm X? Why now? Why still Malcolm? But that reminder that actually Malcolm's politics was always international. He was in Birmingham, where I live, born, like I said, 5 minutes from my mum, still stay. Obviously, I love Birmingham. I always say this, I'm not British, but I am a Brummie. Make that make sense? I don't know. You do. But literally 9 days before he died, he was in Birmingham. So that international story is a really important part of his story. And actually, interestingly enough, Malcolm thinks he gets killed. He's basically saying, I'm going to get killed. And he says it's because of the international work. It's because of going around the African continent. It's because of going to the Muslim world. That's what's actually the thing that gets him killed. He was insisted it was the CIA that would kill him, because he's going around bad-mouthing America at a time when America needs to keep communism out of Africa, needs to keep communism out of the Middle East, and Malcolm was going around just bad-mouthing America, right? And so he was convinced it was the CIA. And actually, one of the conspiracy theories, which probably might be true, is he actually wasn't supposed to come to Birmingham. He left London and was going to France. And when he got to Paris, the French authorities said he couldn't come in. And he'd been to France before, so he was really surprised. Like, why can't I come in? Got deported back to England, and then it was the Indian Workers Association. Indian Workers Association in Birmingham brought him up to Birmingham kind of when they found out he was back in England. And the conspiracy theory is that the reason the French didn't let him in was because they found out the CIA were planning to kill him in France. And they were like, we don't want Malcolm to die in France. And then he does get killed 9 days later. So it's probably not a conspiracy theory, it might just be the truth, right? Actually, his family, Dr. Ilyasha Shabazz, who I'm sure somebody said they met, came down to Oxford. Her and the family are suing the American government. They want the files, they want all the documents, FBI, CIA documents to find out who killed Malcolm X. We actually made a documentary, so if you go on we have a YouTube channel, Make It Plain. If you search Nobody Can Give You Freedom on YouTube, there's a 1.5 hour documentary we made about the book. Includes an interview with Ilyasha Shabazz. We went over to New York and filmed in Birmingham, filmed in London. So if you want to watch a free documentary as well, please do. One of the things I'll start with actually is interestingly about the name Malcolm. Right, so Malcolm's actual name on his passport wasn't Malcolm X. So maybe be surprising, right? Like the X was never. I don't think the X was ever legally established. Malcolm, this is part of the myth where you get the Malcolm was in the nation, went to Mecca, transformed. The idea that Malcolm becomes Al-Hajj Malik Shabazz. Malcolm's name was Malik Shabazz from when he was in the Nation of Islam. That's why his wife is Becky Shabazz. His kids have Shabazz name. The Shabazz name was the name he took, right? So this is not like a new thing when he leaves the nation. The Al Hajj bit because he does the Hajj, but the actual Malik Shabazz was an earlier transformation. And so people ask me why say Malcolm X when his name's Malik Shabazz? And the answer is simply because this is what Malcolm said. Malcolm said, look, the name Malcolm X is such an important political name. It's such an important political naming that I can't drop Malcolm X until the conditions that produce Malcolm X disappear. So Malcolm's going around as, his name's Malik Shabazz, but he's using Malcolm X on purpose. Because remember, the X is about, represents the unknown. The X represents the fact that as an ex-slave, he's been severed from his African roots. And says, look, we have to keep this until the politics that produce it, until the conditions that produce it have disappeared. That's why I always keep Malcolm X. I think Malcolm X is an important political name that Malcolm himself chose to use. All right. So I did say one myth, the biggest myth, it's not the only one, but it seems relevant for this, is this idea that Malcolm, this big transformation after he leaves the Nation of Islam. So there is definitely a transformation. I don't know how much you know about the Nation of Islam. It's a problem. Oh, bless you. The nation is a problematic. The nation is effectively a cult. If we're just being honest, the Nation of Islam, very small organization. One of the actual misunderstandings of Malcolm's relationship to the nation is this idea that when he was in prison, it's the Nation of Islam that makes Malcolm X. This is also untrue, right? Malcolm goes to prison. In prison, he starts to read. He talks about, as he was reading, his mind changed as swiftly as snow falling off a roof. And it really was the reading and the engaging and the thinking which really shifted his perspective. But really before that, Malcolm grew up in a household where both his parents were part of the Garvey movement, Marcus Garvey's movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And he went to meetings with this organization. So he grew up in a very clear black radical tradition. So it's not like he was just a hustler, didn't know anything, went to prison, then converted. He already had this information. He just had gone off the tracks, ended up in prison, etc., etc., etc. And so the nation is important because it gives him a structure. The leader, Elijah Muhammad, becomes like a father figure to him. Malcolm's father's murdered when he was young. So the nation is important, but it's really important to remember that when Malcolm joins the Nation of Islam, it's a very, very small organization, probably 400 members. And really, it's Malcolm that makes the nation. So Malcolm comes out of prison, is sent to Detroit, Atlanta, Boston, New York, literally goes all around America building up the Nation of Islam. If Malcolm doesn't join the Nation of Islam, we would not remember the Nation of Islam at all. This is one of my major criticisms of Malcolm, is he stays in the nation far too long. But the reason is really he made the thing, right? And so it was very hard to walk away. And to be fair, he doesn't actually walk away. He's kicked out, he's expelled. He tries desperately to stay in the nation, even when it's clear that he should have left the nation a long time ago, right? So, thinking about the Nation of Islam is this very problematic thing, right? Never been considered part of Orthodox Islam, right? Has many, many, many dodgy ideas. One of which is the idea of white devils. You've heard the term white devil, right? And in the nation, they actually believe that white people are the devil, like actually really bred to be the devil. And this is a really important, I'd say, it's actually a political idea as much as anything, right? The kind of creation story of how do we get to where we are. But the reason why the nation holds Malcolm back is because in the nation, this idea that white people are devils gives them what they call the religious solution. Right? So if you believe that white people are devils, and in the nation they also believe, and they still believe this is not like an old belief, their time is up, effectively, and God's going to come down and wipe away the white devils. That's the solution to the problem. Which means that you don't need to go out in the streets and protest, you don't need to go and do revolution, you don't really need to do anything. All you do is be a good Muslim, segregate yourself, live separately, and God's going to take care of the rest of it. So the Nation of Islam don't actually get involved in politics at all, right? And so Malcolm from the really early on is trying to push this. He's trying to challenge this, he's trying to change this. And I go at lengths in the book to pick speeches where Malcolm's in the nation talking about politics. Like, we need to organize this, we need to do this, we need to connect. When he's in New York, in Harlem, he's meeting Castro. He's one of the delegation that meets Castro and has a whole meeting with Castro. He's meeting revolutionary leaders from Zanzibar. He's making his international connections. He even gets while he's in the nation in the 50s, late 50s, he gets Elijah Muhammad to send him to Kenya, right? Because he's always thinking internationally. And it's not a new thing. It's not like, oh, well, we didn't need to do international politics. It very much is something he's trying to do. And if you listen to his speeches, you can tell he's really frustrated by the chains that are put on him by the nation, right? Like he's in a debate with James Baldwin in 1960, and he loses the debate because he can't really say anything. Because James Baldwin says, well, why don't you do something? Why don't you do something? And he's like, well, Elijah Muhammad says it's a religious solution. I can't say anything else, right? And you can just see, it's like, well, what else can I say? And so this is always happening in the nation. And the thing, do you anybody know what gets him kicked out? What leads to Malcolm being kicked out of the nation? Yes, so John F. Kennedy gets assassinated. Malcolm had been mercilessly going after Kennedy. Malcolm couldn't stand Kennedy. In fact, thinking about what's one of Malcolm's really important political ideas for today, it is this idea of the northern fox and the southern wolf. All right, so Malcolm always said the problem with the civil rights movement is it focuses on the southern wolf. The southern wolf is that openly racist, hostile, Jim Crow segregation, the person that's snarling at you. And he says, look, the wolf, at least you know where you stand, right? You know the wolf don't like you. And he said the wolf is far better than the northern fox, because the northern fox is that white liberal who will come smiling in your face, but you still end up in the doghouse, right? And so he said, actually, no, Kennedy's worse, because Kennedy's the fox, right? Kennedy's pretending to give you something, and it's actually going to lead you to exactly the same place. And any message we need today, this would be the message that we need today, right? Especially because we're now in the age of the wolf had kind of declined, right? If you think about what happened in the last 60 years since Malcolm passed, we focused heavily on prejudice. How do we get rid of prejudice? How do we get rid of the wolf, right? How do we, like when my mum and dad were walking around the streets in Birmingham, the N-word would be thrown at them. There'd be National Front. Even when I moved into my neighborhood as a young child, there were NF in chalk and pointings to meetings, and I just thought it meant new flowers. And I was like, what is this? I have no idea, right? But that was what we grew up, right? But that's gone. Like when after other than the chalk on the, I don't see any of it. I've been called the N-word 3 times in my entire life, like seriously called it, and each time I kind of laughed and went, what are you doing? All right? What we've done is we focused on the wolf. We've got rid of prejudice to some extent. It's still there, don't get me wrong, but it's declined heavily. And now that's all coming back, right? So now we're seeing the flags go up. You're seeing reform probably get elected. You're seeing this hostility come back, and people are like, "Well, look, this is a problem." Actually, Malcolm would say this is the perfect time to organize, because when you've got the wolf, everybody knows, right? This is when we're talking, like, my favorite government report on racism in this country. Any guesses what it is? My favorite government report. There's one government report on racism that stands above all else. That's the worst. Like that's the liberal fox, terrible one. The best one is Tony Sewell. Honestly, loved it. It was so bad. It was so awful. It was so shockingly terrible that everybody got mad. Right? You understood this is what government racism looks like. Whereas with McPherson, we all celebrated like it was a good thing. But I've actually had McPherson report quoted to me while I've been complaining to my university about racism, saying, "Oh no, that's not racism. Look at the McPherson report." And I'm like, I think I'm an expert. I think I should know, right? But hey, you know. So I love that the Sewell report's perfect because you all got mad. We should have all got mad about McPherson. McPherson was terrible in many ways, but it's in that liberal fox kind of terrible way. So now we are seeing the emergence of the wolf. It makes it easier to see. That's the real face of racism. Trump is the real face of racism. Obama was the fox, pretend it's not racism thing, right? But remember, when did Black Lives Matter start? It started under the first black president, right? So if we're thinking about now, really we need Malcolm in a very real way, right? This is not a time to be despondent. This is a time to organize, because the work will be a lot easier now because people can see what's happening, right? Anyway, that was a little bit of a digression because I was talking about nation. So thinking about a nation, so Malcolm's in the nation, he gets kicked out. He gets kicked out because of this JFK, and again, really I think it's important when we're thinking about radicalism, what does it mean to be a radical organization? The fact that Malcolm is expelled from the nation, suspended from the nation because he criticizes JFK tells you it's not a radical organization, right? So JFK is killed, and Elijah Muhammad says that we don't want to rock the boat. Because remember, the Nation of Islam, they just want to stay away. They just don't want problems. So they actually have always had links to right-wing groups. Actually had links to the American Nazi Party, would you believe? Like formal, actual links. Because they just want to stay quiet, basically. So everybody's told not to say anything about the assassination of JFK. Malcolm being Malcolm, why do we love Malcolm? Because Malcolm just makes it plain, right? Just tells the truth. Actually gives a speech that the next day, and the speech is called God's Judgment on White America, where he doesn't actually say anything about JFK, but it's very clearly about JFK. And then in the Q&A, he says, somebody asks him directly about JFK, and he says, look, as an old farm boy, I can't, when chickens come home to roost, I don't get mad, I can only be glad, right? And it's those words that then get him suspended, etc. But that's Malcolm, that's why we love Malcolm, because you can't stop Malcolm being Malcolm, right? Just plain spoken. Yeah, I got time, right? Because I've read.
Yes, you've got another half an hour.
No, perfect. Okay, so yeah, Malcolm being Malcolm, he can't stop himself, and he gets expelled. Yeah, no, he gets suspended, but like I said, he keeps trying to get back in, but they won't let him back in, right? Now but the best thing that happens to Malcolm is that he gets expelled, is that he can't come back in, because he desperately wants to get back in, but he's kicked out, can't come back in. Why is that the best thing that happens? Because once he's free of the nation, he's free then to say, well, actually, what is the revolutionary politics? So you can't, when we think about Malcolm, the politics in the nation, it's stuck. You can't really go anywhere. The nation is no kind of solution. It's effectively an extremist organization that has, you can say they did some good things. You can still say they do some good things. The best thing the nation do is go into prisons and still do this, go into prisons and work with people who are offenders and clean them up. And that's always been a positive feature of the nation. But politically, you get stuck, right? So had Malcolm stayed in the Nation of Islam, he'd still be alive. Promise you, not be killed. No chance. They'd leave him alone. He's not dangerous. Malcolm would still be with us. Well, he's 100, so he probably still wouldn't be with us now because he's 100 years old. But you know what I'm saying? He would not have been assassinated. Malcolm leaving the nation gives him the opportunity to say, what is the political vision? Now, this is where the myth starts to come in, right? So Malcolm he goes to Mecca in '64, and he talks about how transformative it is seeing white Muslims. Because remember, in the nation, they were told white people are actually devils, like genetically devils. So can't go into Mecca, can't accept true Islam, etc., etc., etc. So when he goes to Mecca, he says, actually, no, look, there's loads of white Muslims. This is clearly not the case. That is eye-opening for him. Right? Now, in the myth, this means he kind of changes completely, softens everything, embraces white people fully. This is really not true. What Malcolm does here is he says, and it's an important change to do actually, is that Malcolm says, no, look, individually, I don't have any problem with individual white people, but white society, I have exactly the same problem I had with white society as I was when before, right? So now I'm talking about whiteness, I'm not talking about white people. This is actually a more radical analysis, right? Because also whiteness can extend to non-white people, right? Some of the the book before this was called The Psychosis of Whiteness, where I argued that whiteness as a set of ideas is so delusional it can only be compared to a psychosis. And I promise you, some of the best examples are the darkest skinned people in the country. Kemi Badenoch, for example, features heavily in The Psychosis of Whiteness. I mean, that is somebody steeped in delusions. So once we get past the individual and start to think about the society, it's actually a more radical analysis. The other thing about being anti-white is that, strangely enough, it centers whiteness. Right? So the Nation of Islam's whole philosophy is centered around being anti-white, which does the very thing you should never do, which is just center whiteness as the basis for what we're doing. Right? There's a reason for it. The thing about something like the Nation, there's a African-American scholar, psychologist called William Cross, who talks about Negro to Black conversion experiences and says that being anti-white is actually an important stage to go through. Right? Because think about it, Cross says, you just live your life, you're not really thinking about racism, then you go learn about the history of society, learn about the British Empire. I mean, it's ironic, I'm a professor, I've been through every single level of schooling in this country, have only ever heard the word empire in a classroom when it has come out of my own mouth, right? I mean, which is insane when you think the British Empire is, you shouldn't be able to understand Britain without teaching the empire, but somehow we managed to do this. So if the first time you hear about the British Empire, I'm actually having this. Was you were talking to? I was on Piers Morgan. I was with Piers Morgan, and I explained to him that the British Empire was actually worse than the Nazis, right? And he thought I was joking. I was like, no, I'm definitely serious. The British Empire lasted longer, killed more people, and in fact, you probably don't have the Nazis without the British Empire. The British Empire is a huge part of what gets you to the Nazis. It's a very straight line between one and the other. So the first time you sit down and learn about all this terrible history, if you weren't anti-white, I'd be surprised. Like, it's a logical thing to do. I go, what is going on? I certainly went through a phase. But importantly, what Cross is saying, that phase is a dangerous phase because what are you doing? You're centering whiteness. To be anti-white is to center whiteness. And what we never want to do is center whiteness. So there's a phase after that Malcolm gets when he leaves a nation, which is actually saying, look, it's not about being anti-white, it's about understanding what the system is, and it's about being anti this system, right? And we should always be anti this system, and Malcolm is always, to the end, to the very end, anti the system that produces the racial inequality that we see today, right? So Malcolm doesn't soften when he comes out of the nation. Malcolm actually gets more radical when he comes out of the nation. All right, Malcolm is talking about, one of my favorite quotes probably from Malcolm. He says, this system can no more provide freedom for black people than a chicken can lay a duck egg. All right, it's just not meant to do it. And that's again, thinking about today, what do we need to know more than anything today? This system cannot no more provide freedom for black people than a chicken can lay a duck egg. It's not meant to do it. So when you're looking at, I can give you all of the facts about racism. I can give you all of the details about racism. And whereas the liberal side will say, well, look, this is an example that the system is not working, right? So the fact that the male youth unemployment rate today in the UK is the same as it was in 1980 is an example that the system's not working. And we can fix it, we can reform it, we can tweak it, and we can change it, and it will work. That's the kind of liberal civil rights Martin Luther King approach, right? Whereas Malcolm's saying, no, the fact that the youth employment rate is the same is the system doing exactly what it's supposed to do. The fact that the poorest part of the world today, in terms of money wealth, is so-called sub-Saharan Africa, and the richest parts of the world are where white people live, and we actually have an economy based on white supremacy, is not the system not working. That's what the system's supposed to do. We live in a white supremacist system. Why would you expect it to produce different results? And once we accept that, then we have to do something else, and that something else is revolution. Malcolm was revolutionary. He was revolutionary from the Garvey days, and he was revolutionary when he died. And he was killed because he was a revolutionary, advancing revolutionary ideas. So importantly, and this is where we get mixed up and confused all the time, what does it mean to be a revolutionary? And Malcolm gives us a clear blueprint. So in the myth of Malcolm, we get this really strong myth of revolution, which is Malcolm's pro-violence, Malcolm wants to kill white people, etc., etc., etc. And this is the standard way that radicalism is produced. And one of the best examples is, I always use that movie, terrible movie, what's it called? Black Panther. You all seen Black Panther? That movie, oh God, it's entertaining, but oh my God, it's like, yeah, entertaining, but the politics are horrendous. Oh my God. So the worst is actually on gender. I won't go into this again. You can ask me if you want. But movie's terrible. I almost walked out about 3 times when I first watched it. But I couldn't because it was a special screening put on by one of our students, so I felt wrong, like getting up and leaving, so I stayed. But anyway, for the purposes of this talk, the Killmonger, Killmonger's character, that's Malcolm X. That's the myth of Malcolm X. You kind of agree with him, right? Wakanda's terrible, it should be doing more. Yes. But what does he want to do with Wakanda? He wants to go kill people. That's what radicalism is represented as today. It's just violent. There's no program to it. It's just, we just want to go and kill everybody. And that's to put you off radicalism. That's to move you away from radicalism, right? Even the way that radicalism gets attached to completely the wrong things. So when we think about Islamic extremism, for example, right? They call this radicalism, right? Not radicalism. It's actually not radicalism at all. Extremism and radicalism are the actual opposite things. Because extremism is when you take the root of an idea and you take it way beyond its practical usefulness, right? The Nazis are extremism. They take the roots of the British Empire. No, actually, no. Actually, no. They actually take the roots of the British Empire and do what they're supposed to do. It's actually not really extreme. The British Empire is probably the more extreme version. But if you actually look at the basis of what the Nazis are doing, it's not in contradiction to Western society. There's a great book about this by Zygmunt Bauman, Holocaust and Modernity. who says that actually modernity, Western modernity, is the only thing that could produce the Nazis. Think about race, the idea of race. Where does that come from? Yeah. Western modernity. It's a product of Western modernity. Science, technology to kill 6 billion people. Where does that come from? Modernity. So what they've done is they've taken those principles and they've taken them to the extreme. In fact, the only real difference with the Nazis is they do it in Europe to people that we consider white. Because all this was happening in the empire, right? And they didn't really care when Leopold killed 10 million Africans. They didn't even have a word for genocide. In fact, the word genocide only comes about after the Holocaust. When Europe had killed how many millions of people? 100, 200, 300? Across the world, Europe had literally wiped out whole populations, and the word genocide only appears after the Holocaust. That tells you a lot about how the West views us, right? And so that's extremism, right? If you take Islamic extremism, that's taking the principles and taking them way too far, right? Extremism. That's the same kind of argument. Radicalism is the opposite, right? Radicalism says we take the fundamentals of something and we totally reject them. So if you're a Marxist, for example, you say, well, look, capitalism is terrible, we want to do something else. If you're a black radical, you say, look, this is terrible, we want to build a different alternative society. That's radicalism. In fact, you can't actually have radical Islam because it would no longer be Islam. You would take the principles and say, I don't want to do it, we'll do something else. It's actually an oxymoron. Radical Islam is an oxymoron. But the whole point of this is to get us away, to scare us away from actual radicalism by naming things which aren't radicalism, radical. Right? And one of the most dangerous things that's actually happened is that the real radicalism has gone. Right? This is what's the big change between Malcolm being alive and Malcolm now, and now. Is if Malcolm was standing here 60 years ago, talking about revolution, it was a real thing. Pan-African revolution, Marxist revolution, Latin America, Asia, there's actual revolution. Right? This is a real tangible thing. And the big change that's happened since then is that that's gone. For two reasons. One is killed a lot of people. People like Malcolm get killed. Lots of people get killed in the third world. But the bigger reason actually is this system is very good at making concessions. Right? So I get another principle of Malcolm, which is a theory of Malcolm, which is really, really important. House Negro, field Negro. Now, I actually got the police came to my house because I called Calvin Robinson. Calvin Robinson was the GB News presenter, had a big afro, and I didn't even call him a house Negro. I just used him as an example of a house Negro, and he called the police, and I had to go. I had to have an interview with the police station. Totally farcical. But the actual idea is really important, because what's the idea of the house Negro? What Malcolm was saying in House Negro, Field Negro, is that on the plantation, there's people who work in the house and there's people who work in the field. If you work in the house, then you get slightly better treatment. Right? So you get slightly better food, you're not outside all day, you're slightly better clothes, you're close to the master. And because of that privilege, you can start to identify with the master. So Malcolm says a house Negro identifies with the master more than the master identifies with himself. Right? The house Negro gets sick, he says, what's the matter, boss? We sick. Right? It's a proper malady, right? And you see this all the time, right? This is the reason I called Calvin Robinson. Sorry, the reason I used Calvin Robinson as an example, be careful of my language, of a house Negro is because we were on Good Morning Britain together in COVID, and so he could see into his bedroom, and in his bedroom he had a picture of the Queen, and he had Union Jack bed sheets. I didn't even know they sold Union Jack bed sheets. I was really surprised, right? But identified with the master more than the master identified with himself. And now this isn't. It kind of is an insult to call somebody a house Negro, don't get me wrong, but it's not really, right? What Malcolm's doing with this is he's saying, look, you think that you have it better, you think that you're privileged, but actually you're still a slave, right? If you live in the house, you're still a slave, you're not free. Malcolm's saying you're one of us. He actually calls this love teaching and says I wouldn't be telling this if I didn't love you. The whole thing with house Negro, say, look, stop being a house Negro, come with us, come with the field, come with the field. And this is a really important thing today for us as well, especially people like me. I am undoubtedly, economically, structurally, a house Negro. Know that, professor of anything, right? I have more money than most people in the world. Actually, everybody in this room earns more money than most people in the world, because most people in the world don't really earn much at all. In fact, if Malcolm was alive today, a house Negro, field Negro would more be about West, non-West, because the conditions here are so disparate to what they are in the underdeveloped world, which is why you have so many people trying to get into the house. To be the poorest person in the UK makes you probably in the top 80% earners in the world. because of the welfare state. You're not going to, it's very rare you're going to starve, right? Whereas if you go to places like Nigeria, Congo, India, India, we talk about India being one of the richest economies. No, there are a lot of rich people in India, and then there was a lot of really, really, really poor people. Take the top 10% rich out of India, heavily poor, right? So actually, most people in the world today live in very similar conditions to what they lived in 60 years ago. Actually, hasn't changed at all. Very, 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 very similar, right? So this is important, again, to think, what are we doing? When we think about politics, what's the politics? Malcolm's articulation of House Negro was to say, you should be with the field. We should be making politics based on those in the field. And I said those in the field today are those in the going down mines so that we can have these phones, right? For our electric cars and all the things. That's the field, right? The people making our clothes, that's the field. So when we're thinking about what is the political movement of the time, it can't be, so much of our political movements in the UK are about how do we feel better in the house, when it should be actually how are we making conditions better in the field. And the thing that we actually have to grapple with now is, whereas when Malcolm was alive, we weren't really in the house. You know, we didn't have racial legislation. I couldn't be professor of black studies. We were very clearly outside. The change that was made is they let us in enough so that we're now all kind of part of it, right? And that accepting that is a big thing, right? And we have to do. We have to understand our privilege. It's really, really important to do that. So I always say I'm a recovering house Negro. Right? I have to be. It'll be so easy for me to turn around and say, well, look, I've made it. Why can't you make it? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, etc., etc. I can actually make a lot of money out of this. Maybe that's what might be my next book. Might be the one where I try and become the conservative prime minister of the country. I won't do that. I promise. Anyway, so yeah. What else do I want to say? So Malcolm X Revolution. Now, what's important about Malcolm?
So you've got 5 more minutes.
All right, perfect.
Do you want to relate it back to the topic again on the organisation of African American unity?
That's what I was
yes, good.
Okay. Sorry. So, all that to say, all right. So, what is the formation that Malcolm uses? Now, slightly ironic here because at a Muslim institute. But what does Malcolm do when he leaves a nation? He actually makes a very clear separation of his religion and his politics. Very clear. So remember, in the nation, it's very much about, the religion is the solution. Be a good Muslim, God takes care of the rest. When he leaves a nation, he says, actually, no, he becomes more Islamic, more devoutly Islamic. He embraces Sunni Islam. When he goes on his travels, he travels to Saudi in the Middle East, and he's trying to get money for scholarships. And essentially, he wants to be the representation of true Islam in America, basically, for Black America. So he sets up Muslim Mosque Incorporated. He's an imam. It's a religious organization, etc., etc. But he separates that and says, that's the religion, that's for me, and the organization of my politics is the organization of Afro-American unity. And he says, this is a secular organization. He says, in this organization, it's an organization for black people where you have to leave your religion at home, otherwise we're going to fight, we're going to argue, etc., etc., etc. So the actual political formation of the OAU is entirely secular. And he's trying to say, how do we bring together people across all of the different religious boundaries that we have? Now, this is really important because Malcolm's politics is black revolutionary politics, which is Pan-African, which is saying, look, how do we link America, the Caribbean, African continent, and you have so many different religions. So he's making this case, look, we can all come together despite our religions. I can be devoutly Islamic, that's important to me, but actually politically, that separation is also a really important separation, right? So how does that link into Muslim organizing, right? Because that's a challenge, right? We're saying, well, actually, what's the best way to organize around, right? Now, there's some really important principles of the OAU which are useful across the board. So one of those is the international principle, right? Malcolm's international principle is very much Pan-Africanism. So he says, look, Africa will go no further any faster than we will, and we will not go forward any faster than Africa will. And when Malcolm talks about African Americans, he actually means every black person that's not in Africa. So African Americans is Caribbean, Latin America, Europe, doesn't matter where you are. And he's saying, look, the actual way that we go forward is as an international body, right? And that's a really important principle because, again, we think about these nation states. A nation state's the biggest barrier to revolutionary politics. Nation state keeps you confined into these absolutely made up borders in the UK, but also around the world, right? Who decided India was a country, Pakistan was a country, Bangladesh was a country? Who decided Nigeria was a country? My family's Jamaican. That's entirely made up by the West, right? By Britain. So what are we doing when we do that? To silo ourselves off into the nation is really to make a massive mistake. We should always be trying to organize cross borders. Other thing about that, so that's on the big scale, but on the smaller scale, OAU very much based on the UNIA, Universal Negro Improvement Association, which had chapters around the world. Actually, the largest black organization ever existed that had 2 to 8 million members in 1920s across about 50 countries. The UNIA was a massive organization. And so Malcolm, again, inspired by the UNIA, says you need to have a national organization that is also grassroots at the very same time. So yeah, this is why you have chapters in different parts, which say, look, in Harlem, we're going to do this, and then we're going to connect this to Kinshasa, we'll connect this to Kingston, we'll connect this to London. But the local is really, really important because you have to be grassroots, you have to be with the people, and that grassroots local organizing is really, really, really an important part of how do you get people in and then how do you connect up, right? The other thing that was important, and I think that has really important nowadays, is that Malcolm talked, and this is one of the reasons that for the confusion of where Malcolm's politics goes. So when Malcolm leaves the nation, starts at OAU, he reaches out to all the civil rights leaders. In fact, he'd done this before, but he tried again after he left the nation. And some of the politics of the OAU sound quite liberal civil rights. So they wanted to have rent strikes. They said you should vote. They said register to vote. Like, it's really important that you register to vote. They were trying to get people elected onto local the education school board. So these all sound very civil rightsy, right? And so people have then said, oh look, Malcolm clearly became a civil rights leader, but this is really, 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 really not true, right? So in classic Malcolm X style, somebody asks him, he used to call, so Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, actually Malcolm was actually a little bit older than King. They were doing the same thing at the same time. They only met once in their whole time, mostly because King didn't want to meet Malcolm. King just wouldn't meet Malcolm. But King wouldn't meet Malcolm because Malcolm kept calling him an Uncle Tom. Malcolm kept really laying into him, criticizing him. Yeah, we don't like. And so when Malcolm leaves in 65, January 65, after he softened his tone and people are saying he's moving to civil rights, he gives his interviews. It's actually online. You can find it. It's Pierre Burton on 1965. It's in January, the year that he dies. And the interviewer asked him. He says, "Now you've softened your approach. Would you stop calling Martin Luther King an Uncle Tom?" And Malcolm's response is, "Well, in America they like to sue. They're very litigious. So I no longer call him an Uncle Tom. I just call him Uncle Martin." Right? That's Malcolm. Malcolm literally never changed. There's no change because, importantly, the civil rights looking aspects of the OAU were what Malcolm called the short range program. He says, look, in the short range, you live in Harlem, you live in Birmingham, you live in London or whatever. We have to improve the conditions of people that live where we live. So how do you do that? One of the levels you can pull is through electoral politics. And particularly in America, where they have a lot more direct democracy, the reason they wanted to get people elected onto the school board is because they wanted the school board to give 10%, which was the amount of the 10% of the school population at that time were African American, and they wanted to get the school board to give 10% of the budget to the OAU so they could run black schools, right? So it's saying, look, we are where we are. You have to pull the levers you can pull, but the long-range program of the OAU is not to get more people into the house. It's not to get more people to get better jobs in America. The long-range program is the Pan-African Revolution, but while we're here, we have to do the short range. And again, this is something to think about strategically, right? As a radical, I'm still going to argue for electoral politics if it can get us the things that we need to get. And I'll end on this because I think it's a good metaphor. The metaphor I use in the book for my own position is, look, professor is I'd never use the title professor unless I need to get paid. It gets me more money. I love it for that reason. But other than that, I see professor as very much chief constable, I would say. Or what I've started using is slave preacher. All right? And the reason for this is, what was the purpose of the slave preacher? The purpose of the slave preacher was to pacify the enslaved. That's why the slave preacher, and the slave preacher had privilege because of that. Could go around different plantations, could talk to big groups of people, could read, because their job was to pacify the enslaved. And if we're being honest, why did they open up universities to black and brown people in the 1990s? It was because there was riots in the 80s and they were terrified of us. And they were like, what do we do with these young people? Let's get them into university, right? And then and nowadays we can load them with debt and we can turn them into house Negroes. That's my job. That's what the university is about. It's about how do we transform these young people into neoliberal subjects. That's why I get paid what I get paid. That's a modern day slave preacher. Sounds negative, I'm going to end on a positive. But I don't know if you ever heard Nat Turner in America and Sam Sharp in Jamaica led two of the biggest slave rebellions in those countries, the biggest slave rebellions in those countries. Both of them were what? Slave preachers. Because the slave preacher has privilege, could organize, could do things, and they use their privilege to subvert the system. This is how we have to think. We're in these jobs, we're in these roles, we're in these positions. Can we use that to subvert the system and to create revolution? That's the metaphor, and that's where we need to be. And I think if Malcolm was alive today, that's certainly be what he's trying to get us to do now. And I'll end there, I think.
Thank you so much.